Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking to Shawn Rife again, one of the heads of risk analysis at Experian. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about credit repair, and at the end, we'll segue into business credit, and then at the very end, we'll just transition into some of the future of what the credit landscape is going to look like in terms of FICO algorithms, and then even AI integration, a very interesting subject as AI is becoming, the trend and kind of the progression that both personal and business fields are moving in. So look forward to that. And if you guys have any questions that you want me to explore further, leave them down below in the comments.
Yeah, so I did a second presentation with the finance club, and then from that, I kind of picked up a lot of things on, just general questions, a lot of it pertaining to people building credit. I think we really hit that in the last interview, steps that you should take when you're first starting out. But when I was home, I had a lot of my relatives actually asked me questions because they didn't take the right steps when they started out. So they actually damaged their credit quite a bit, and they were asking me for advice when it came to getting back on the right track. Because cadets, we're all relatively new to credit, so a lot of the information I shared was just how to start off on the right foot and start building credit the right way, kind of using some of those guiding principles that you talked about in our last interview. But having spoken with some of my relatives and some people back home who you didn't know that information, made some mistakes out the gate, how can we course correct, in particular, just steps for credit repair, and just for repairing damaged credit in terms of just timeline, steps to take, and kind of what the best practices are in that scenario. Because, we already kind of hit on how to start off correctly, but now how do we course correct if we, made a few mistakes starting out?
Yep, Jaden, I love the direction that you're going because at the end of the day, it's interesting in America. I would say two of the most important subjects are never taught in high school or college. And that's number one with the bullet to me, negotiations.
Oh,
And
yeah.
if there were a close number two, it would be credit education. So
Yeah.
that is not a surprise. And believe me, that this knows no age or certainly branch of the military. So definitely excited to have this conversation.
Cool. Yeah. So, I guess I'll explain it with a case study. Just kind of what my situation that I heard from my relative, and kind of what you would do or how you would navigate a situation such as this. Because like you said, this is kind of a trend that people in a trap that sometimes people fall into, and they might not know the best way to navigate out of it. So my aunt, when she asked me about, what do I do with my credit, I asked her, okay, what cards do you have open? How long have you had them open for? And she started listing off a bunch of different store branded credit cards like Kohl's, Macy's, any store that she shopped with. Anytime that the store clerk or the rep has been like, hey, do you want to sign up for this card? She's almost always agreed. And then she had racked up, balances on those cards, a lot of interest, hasn't paid them off. Now she's juggling, I think, when we did the math, it was like 10 plus cards that all have a balance on them, which is a very slippery slope to get in. So what would you do in that scenario, or how would you go about navigating and course correcting from that situation?
Sure. If I could take one step back, typically in a situation like that, the first thing that people are going to want to do is go into credit repair, capital letters, right? The proper
Okay.
noun, as opposed to lowercase repairing your credit repair, right? So we're talking in this situation about a person who has a lot of revolving debt. So in the eyes of pretty much every credit algorithm, that's going to take points off if your utilization gets higher than a certain percentage. And think about utilization as nothing more than a fraction. You've got your numerator and your denominator. Now, the denominator is your total revolving debt, right? So that would be ostensibly in this situation, all 10 of her credit cards all put together, right? And so the numerator would be your outstanding debt that you actually have. So the balance limit, if you will, is your denominator versus what you actually have out as your numerator. In that situation, you generally don't want to have more than about 20 to 25% utilization. So let's just say that you had $100 in total revolving debt that was available to you. You don't want any more out than say 25 at any given time, because if you do, it starts to hit that utilization and that starts to ding your actual credit. Now, we're not even going to talk right now about the delinquency. It sounds like we'll probably get there. The first thing that I would do is, in my mind, I wouldn't actually worry so much about the number of credit cards that you have because you don't get penalized for that. What you get penalized on is, again, that utilization. So to me, if we're in a situation where you simply cannot pay off all of your credit cards, believe it or not, you're going to want to actually take an inventory of all of your cards, and you're going to want to see which ones have the largest available credit balance, right? And believe it or not, you're going to want to keep those because that will make sure that you maintain the lowest utilization. The mistake that sometimes people make is they say, okay, I've got to get rid of some of these credit cards because I'm just too over leveraged. So they do that. And if you think about it like this, right? Let's say that I got rid of one of the cards that had a lot of available extra credit. Well, I've just automatically cut my overall denominator by a huge amount, right? And so my utilization actually skyrockets. So what you see is people typically have worse credit after they get rid of some of their cards for a little while. That's typically the reason why. So the short answer I would say is do whatever it takes to get that utilization as low as possible and then go from there, right? The answer to every single one of these questions, Jaden, is always going to be make sure that you are making at least your minimum monthly payment and you are not going 30 days delinquent. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, for sure. That was kind of something that I discussed with her that, you don't want to close out those cards. I took it from the credit age perspective. Not, you don't want to give that up, but that's a point too that I should hit on with the utilization ratio. And I guess, yeah, like you said, the conversation is going to probably go in this direction where we are talking about missed payments, especially during COVID. Like, she lost her job and there was a lot of different factors playing into that financially. So what kind of happens when you do, go delinquent on payments? What are some of the penalties for that? And then how do you move forward afterwards?
Yep. Let me make one point before we get into this too. So the really good thing about credit is you are never dinged for having good credit and having done the right thing. I know that there's some fear out there that if I get rid of an old credit card, right, I'm going to give up some of that payment history. The really good news is that positive credit history stays on as long as it is allowable at each of the three credit bureaus. And so that's typically about 10 years. The better news on top of that is negative information is destined to fall off in a lot shorter period than 10 years, right? You have certain types of bankruptcies like a Chapter 7 or 13 in particular. Yeah, it can last up to 7 years, but most of the time, things like hard inquiries, 24 months, right? Negative of the type that we're about to talk about now, delinquencies, typically between 3 and 5 years, right? So having said that, let's talk a little bit about the delinquencies and how they're treated. To do that, you really have to understand what each of the algorithms is really kind of testing you on in terms of what matters to determine how to make your score as high as possible. I say that there are three main factors: your future or current credit history, your past credit history, and if you will, just your overall credit mix, if you will. So if we go back and we look at history, we know that arguably it's probably the plurality, somewhere between 30 and 35%, depending on how old you are. It's how much credit you've had, how long you've had credit, in other words. So the longer you've had credit, to your point earlier, the better your score can be. That's kind of your baseline. However, the next best and most important part is certainly your credit history in terms of its usage, its ups and downs. And so I would break that out into two particular areas. I would talk about that in terms of your last 24 months as evidence, number one, by your hard inquiries, and number two, how you've handled your trade lines, your credit trade lines within that 24 months. Your score is going to be most keenly attuned to that. Those ups and downs over the last 2 years will really make the most difference. And then there's the information that we were just talking about, right? Your credit history as it goes beyond 24 months, the positive and the negative. The less dips that there were, the higher that credit's going to be. And certainly it's magnified within the past 24 months. Now, I know we'll talk a little bit about credit cards, and we already have. Another key aspect to this would be your credit mix. All things being equal, you're going to put greater weight, put greater appreciation. You'll get better points, if you will, right? For having installment debt, which would be like a student loan, typically autos, certainly mortgages, things like that. Then they would be revolving debt, which are typically things like credit cards or title loans sometimes, things like that. So if we start to look at that together, then we know that as long as we are making due on all of our credit obligations, positive history, if you will, that is the maximum that we can do. So regardless of whether we're overutilized or what have you, that is always the gold standard. Now, when we don't, right, two things can happen, right? All of it has to do with number one, with a bullet, what the actual lender reports to the actual bureaus themselves. Typically, they will report exactly the same thing to each of the three bureaus. So what you're going to want to focus on is, have I made due with what I was supposed to within the past 30 days? Do I have a 30 days past due, right? Now, usually your payments due every month. When you miss that, theoretically, the lenders can report that as 30 days past due. Now, the scores, believe it or not, the algorithms of FICO scores don't necessarily know what to do with something that's only 30 days late. In fact, we call that indeterminate. So it's not necessarily that 30 days late that is going to drop your credit score. It's probably how you've handled the rest of your credit that can do that. Now, to be clear, you go 30 days late, you theoretically can start to see a score drop. Where you really start to see the score drop is after that 60 and especially the 90 days past due. So the reason I said that, the past is prologue here, Jaden, the first thing that you are going to want to do, if you have an inkling that you are about to go late on that trade line, particularly a credit card, be the first person to get on the phone, talk to customer support, let them know, and see if there's something that can be worked out. 9 times out of 10, they don't necessarily need to report that, and you can come up with some type of plan that won't hit your credit report and thus not trigger the algorithms of the FICO score or Vantage score or whatever they're using, right? So then it gets acutely worse every 30 days. 30 days, typically not a big deal. We call that an indeterminate phase. 60 days, kind of the same, depending on the algorithm. 90 days is where it really all starts to hit home. And then once you get over 180 days, it can start to do major damage to your credit report and even be considered a collection if it's actually charged off after, say, the 180-day period.
Can you just go a little bit into collection, just kind of define that for us?
Yeah. So collections are defined as the point in time in which the lender decides that they are no longer going to carry that actual trade line on their books, and thus they release it. So they essentially absolve themselves of the debt. They actually call it a loss, and then we actually put that as something called a public record. Now, credit generally is 3 specific things. In fact, we call it TIPS to basically be an acronym for those 3 things.
Sure.
The T stands for credit trade line, right? So when you take out a home loan or an auto loan or a student loan or a credit card, that is a trade line, right? That's the most important aspect of. There are the inquiries, which I'm sure we'll talk about, right? Have you applied for credit? If they're hard inquiries, they can actually impact your credit score. And then lastly, we have the P, which is what's applicable here. That stands for public records. Nowadays, public records are only 2 things: only collections and only bankruptcies. And in the face of collections, it's actually a very, very limited view that we could even consider a collection anymore. But let me talk about typically what that means. After this year, after June 24th of last year, 2022, we changed the rules so that any paid medical collections no longer hit the actual credit report. Before that, we actually removed in 2017 due to something called NCAP. I'm sorry, that was 2019, something called NCAP, the National Consumer Assistance Plan, all civil liens and judgments. So we considered that a public record, right? So if somebody was putting a lien on your property or your chattel or something like that, we could see that on the actual credit report. That was done away with in 2019. And after that, we actually started taking a really deep look at other collections besides medical collections. And we decided, okay, you know what? If this medical or other collection is lower than $500, then we're not going to report it on the actual credit profile either. So now realistically, you're in a situation where a collection is defined as somebody who is essentially charged you off if you owed in excess of $500. We've been having this conversation even last year. It would be a little bit different, but collections are important because that hits another side of your actual credit report. It's basically saying that not only has this person gone delinquent, he or she has not even remotely adhered to the terms of that agreement. So that could actually hit even more than just simple delinquencies themselves. And when they start to pile up, which they often do in these situations, they can really have a negative impact on your credit, and they trigger a whole new set of actions. Something akin to, but typically not as terrible as a bankruptcy.
Okay. Gotcha. So collections now are kind of defined as anything exceeding $500 that has not been paid because that is a breach of the terms of agreement with the original lender who provided the trade line.
Not to say that you can't get a sub $500 collection. It's just that that sub $500 collection will not hit your credit report. And so I know that in terms of collection agencies who will sometimes call or send emails or what have you, they'll make it feel like if you don't take care of this right away, it's going to impact your credit score. If it is below 500, it will not. So you'll typically see this a lot with, say, like a Verizon or a mobile carrier or something like that. If you go into collections, or even like think about like a personal trainer, like a gym or something like that, those are usually below $500.
Yeah.
Those are something that you did have an obligation with. And if they're in the wrong, the first thing you're going to want to do is dispute that, right? And challenge it, of course.
Mm,
But don't believe for a second if they tell you that that collection is going to impact your credit score, because it won't.
good to know. Good to know. So yeah, I mean, uh, knowing that, when you're faced with collections and you're faced with this outstanding debt, step number one, you said, is trying to lower your utilization as much as possible. I was talking about ways to track it, or just ways to get a sense of what the overall picture is looking like, because it can be very overwhelming when you have to juggle all these different things. Um, I guess this is more outside the realm of credit, more just personal finance, being responsible with credit. But what are some tips you'd give when you're trying to, maybe tackle the problem holistically, whether it be tracking, monthly expenses, or tracking the usage of each card? What are some things you'd suggest trying to go about remedying that?
Yep. In short, I would look at my credit and my financial picture the
Okay.
exact same way that I track my health, right? In fact, I call this credit and financial health. One of the perfect ways to do that, just the same way that people will do an entire lab of like blood tests and things like that, you should have an entire lab done, if you will, of your financial picture. So let's talk for credit just for a moment here, because it's kind of the center of what we've been
Yeah.
talking about. One should always know what his or her credit score is and what their credit report looks like. There are a couple ways to do it, both free, neither hurting your credit score. And this is key, because one of the myths out there is that if I check my own credit, that of itself is going to be considered an inquiry, and that's going to ding my credit score.
Right.
It won't. That's considered a soft inquiry, not hard, never can hurt your credit score if you did it a million times in a day, right? So what I would recommend would be going to Equifax.com, Experian.com, or TransUnion.com, and enrolling in a monitoring service that is free, that allows you to check your score as well as have access to the totality of your credit profile. And what does a credit profile have? It has a couple things that are going to be important. Number one, what we call the credit header file. That is the information that all banks, all lenders are going to see. So you want to make sure that it's correct. Typically, all it is: first name, last name, address, social security number, sometimes date of birth. Make sure that's always correct, because if it's not, in very, very limited situations, it can get confused for someone else's credit, or to the point where it gets confusing and you'll get denied credit. Won't hurt your credit score, but it does hurt your access until you can figure that out. Just knowing, right,
Right.
that they have your identity down is always very, very important, right? And then you have what we call below the credit header. And that's the information that we've really been talking about, those tips. It will list out your credit trade lines, all of them that are still accurate, that are, yeah, still online, that you can see by the actual lenders themselves. And it can go back anywhere from 24 months all the way back to about 5 years, right? That will give you an idea. And it actually, in many cases, has a month by month look in terms of if you paid on time, or if you were past due, how many days you were past due. So that gives you the ability to do two things, right? Number one, gives you the ability to know exactly how much credit you have out and how much credit you've been seen to have had out. And number two, gives you the ability to dispute. Because if you're seeing on there that they're saying that you were late or you were having something that was past due, then you can actively take that and go through the entire dispute process, which we can talk about. So I would say that part's going to be extremely important, just as important as a resume, if you will, when you're actually applying for jobs after school, right? That's going to be really kind of the sheet that tells you and is your source of truth. Then that will also show you the inquiries that you've had as well. And if you're seeing too many inquiries, Jaden, then that means probably you're applying for too many types of credit, right? The more inquiries you have, generally speaking, the worse that actually is. There's a showcase for all of that. And then lastly, you're going to have those public records that we were talking about, right? It will list any collections or bankruptcy activity there. The totality of all that is essentially just like running labs for your physical well-being. You do that, you will always keep your finger on the pulse of your credit. You'll always know where you're at. You'll always have the ability to dispute. And if you're doing that at least once a month, you will be credit healthy. And I would say the exact same things in the other aspects of your credit profile. Always, your financial profile. Always know your bank statements, right? Look at that DDA, that stands for direct deposit account, right? That could be a checking, savings, or money market account. Look at your cash flow statements, right? We think about the balances, right? The balance sheets that we get as just pieces of paper. That's your cash flow. And in this world, cash flow is king. We talk about cash is king. No, cash flow is king. So that will show you the amount of income that you have coming in, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that be, something that happens intermittently or direct deposit, that's key, right? Lenders look at that. You need to know that to always know what you have coming in relative to your expenditures. And then even looking at things like the number of accounts, so account volume, right? The number of transactions, insufficient fund transactions, that kind of things. Keeping your finger on the pulse of how many account closures that you have. Looking at all that gives you a great idea. So just making sure that you're aware and are monitoring your financial cash flow and credit, that's really key.
Gotcha. So you kind of touched on it, and I kind of want to go deeper into the dispute process. And also you mentioned earlier the NCAP, or I want to make sure I got that right. The consumer, what was it, approval plan or
National Consumer Assistance Plan?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and that started in 2019.
Okay. Yeah, so I kind of want to just go a little bit deeper in that. What are some maybe recent or I guess relevant consumer protection laws that have been passed, and kind of how that ties into the dispute process, or if it ties into the dispute process, and kind of what tools or things you might have at your disposal if you're trying to come back from, damaged credit.
Yep. So let's start at the very end first, right? If you're seeing any of the things that we're about to talk about on your credit profile, or you're being told that they are factors in a decision, then you automatically need to be disputing because they've already been either terminated or they're just things that are not supposed to be done in the credit world, right? You mentioned NCAP, the National Consumer Assistance Plan. Essentially what that was in 2019, 32 state attorneys general got together and they said, hey, bureaus, anybody who is actually taking people's credit and actually looking at them and determining whether that they're going to extend credit or not, you can do so as long as all of the data in there are what we call FCRA regulated, Fair Credit Reporting Act regulated, meaning that it is displayable on a credit report. It is disputable by the actual consumer, him or herself. And the only way to do that is to be able to see it displayable on a credit report. And if there is something wrong by the bureaus, it has to be correctable. So we call that disputable, displayable, correctable. We're going to take that a step further, right? Technically speaking, back in the day, we considered the following public records types of FCRA regulated data that were disputable, displayable, and correctable. That were civil liens and they were judgments, right? We're saying you can no longer use that for an approval or declination. They didn't technically outlaw it. In fact, there are certain credit agencies out there that do leverage it. You see it a little bit more like the subprime space, but by and large, all three of the main bureaus by which you're going to be actually had your credit looked at, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, have absolutely 100% purged those from the database itself. So you should never have a civil lien or judgment impact your credit score at all. Doesn't mean that you can't have certain collections like we've talked about, but that was the first step, right? So if you're seeing anything like that or you're hearing about that, you automatically know there's something wrong.
Okay.
The next thing that I would say that happened was something called Regulation F. And that is an evolving set of regulations, and that actually affects the collections world as well. There are a number of different aspects to Reg F, but what I would say the most important Reg F regs, what they are, have to do with medical collections, as we've talked about,
Right.
as well as those small dollar collections. So probably don't need to revisit those, but suffice it to say that medical collections are treated differently, right? They have to be at least 180 days old before they can even impact your score or even be seen on a credit profile. And if you pay those off, then they automatically have to drop. Most collections, even if you pay them off, can still stay on your credit report for a number of years, somewhere between 3 and 5 years, depending on the type of collection, right? That and they went a step further. And they said that, we see different outcomes for different groups, in particular protected classes, people in the inner cities, the younger, right? Other types of demographics that are out there that we think is unfair. Who are more likely to be affected by those small dollar collections? Well, people, frankly, who have less ability to cure that, less ability to pay. So there's an unfairness happening here. So let's go out there and let's say that anybody less than $500, that's not going to show up on a credit profile. That's one thing. And then what I would say the other thing is there have been some changes in terms of just in terms of the actual new credit algorithms themselves, what they're actually looking at and when they start to look at them, right? So we talked about the medical collections, paid medical collections, but then there's also this idea of authorized user treatment. And so this in a way works a little bit against the actual consumer, him or herself, but essentially the authorized user treatment says that if you are an authorized user, we can only, or we will typically only look at that just from a basic standpoint of here's a person who actually now has credit out. We used to actually almost go so far as to assign the actual credit score and the actual credit history link of the person who was granting the authorized usership, which was helping a lot of people. But again, was very disparate because who are the people who were able to be authorized users? People who had parents or other family members or other people who were wealthier. And so that was a little bit disparate. So those are some of the key differences that we see.
That makes sense. And you said this Regulation F is an evolving regulation. So is there any type of collection that you might, I guess, predict or you could foresee potentially getting added as something rolled into consumer protection when it comes to collections or things along the line of, the previously added types of collection?
Yeah, I think if you were able to claim some type of financial or physical hardship, I think it's only a matter of time before those are washed away as well. Right. So if we were to look at COVID as an example of this, we used to have something called and we still do, we have something called a special comment code that is on every credit report. And the idea behind that is there are certain codes and conditions that happen that should be sending a red flag to the actual lender. In either word, saying in some way saying that, okay, here's a person who's not doing what he or she's supposed to do, so it's bad. But really they were designed to help in the sense that here's something that he or she can't control beyond their control that's actually hurting them. The perfect example was the COVID situation and something called an AW. That's just a code. It doesn't stand for anything. AW special comment code. Now that's been around for a good 25 years, but what it was designed to be used during natural disasters like an earthquake or a tornado or something like that, where if you actually lost your home or lost your ability to work because of some type of calamity that was outside of your control, if you claim that and they saw that on the credit report, anything from that point after to the point it was lifted that went delinquent cannot impact your credit score, right? Because it's not your fault, right? And so what we saw that, and we went from, it was never higher than 0.5% of the entire US population who ever had an AW, think Katrina, that's probably the largest time where that had ever happened, to now COVID, where that was automatically added. And so that was about 20% of the population. I bet at some point in time, they're going to make that a law where anybody who is having some type of unfortunate financial situation beyond their control, maybe as simple as just losing your job, right? Maybe as simple as, some type of health scare or something like that could actually be factored into that. I also think the next area that this is going to be very heavily impacted by is going to be something very relevant to you, student loans, right? The idea here that in some situations, the students themselves didn't know what they were getting into, or the actual outcomes relative to the expenditures
Right.
shouldn't justify having to pay that much, right? And
Right.
so we've already seen that on some level. I bet that's the next shoe to drop.
But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit. As a lot of the questions I got in the 2 presentations I gave were, I just don't know where to start. What's the best credit card to start with? And I kind of want to just hit on that because I think personally, my answer boils down to what are you looking for? But also when you're starting out, your options are a bit more limited. So, I just kind of get your input on that. And then after transition into a business credit and kind of how that differs from the personal credit side of things.
So I think the business credit part's going to be a much easier answer, right?
Okay.
And I know that we all want these linear answers, right? If you do X, then Y will happen, right?
Yeah.
So what do you recommend? And so I can do that. And I'm going to do that
Okay.
at the end. But I really do think that the answer is complicated, particularly in the credit card space, because to your really good point, Jaden, it's all about what you are trying to accomplish. So let's just talk about this within the scope only of credit cards, right? In a perfect world, like we talked about earlier, the way that you would actually get access to a credit card would be to be an authorized user
Mhm.
of somebody else's credit card, right? That will give you access to a credit line. And if you've never had credit before, which most people under the age of 18 wouldn't, this now starts to actually create a credit profile for you, right? It establishes your credit. And more importantly than that, and this is why we can't answer this in a linear fashion, it helps you beat what I call the 180-day rule. Now, what that is specifically is that, as we all know, the number one credit reporting algorithm out there is Fair Isaac or the FICO score, right? We all know this. In fact, 80 to 90% of all credit decisions are made using the actual FICO score itself. But most people don't realize that what a credit score is in the eyes of FICO is it's saying, I'm only going to score you if you have at least one opened or closed or updated credit trade line within the past 6 months, right? And so if you don't have any credit, by definition, you don't have a past
Yeah.
6 months or 180 days, right? So you're not even scoreable yet. So the first thing that most people would say is, give me a card name, right, that I can go after right now. Well,
Yep.
in a lot of cases, you won't get anything because you don't have anything to be scoreable, right? And so that's why I would say, like, if you can in any way possible, be that authorized user. Now, I know that's not possible for everybody. So I'm just saying, pie in the sky, that's where you'd want to be, right?
Right.
If you are not that person, right? I certainly wasn't when I was 18. Then the next best thing to do, which wasn't in existence when I was 18, would be to go specifically to Experian.com. And the reason I call them out is because they have 2 programs, one called Go and the other called Boost. And what that does is, if you have no credit profile whatsoever, it helps you establish credit and really kind of helps you beat that 180-day rule that we were talking about. In fact, they have another free program. Everything I've talked about, by the way, is free, is something that's called Credit Match. And so it's essentially an enrollment program. Once you become part of Credit Match, it essentially matches you to the types of credit card offers that you have a pretty strong chance of getting. I call that pre-qualification, right? And so that algorithm already knows, by definition, if you have more or less than 180 days, and it actually can apply certain algorithms that can still theoretically get you credit if you have less than 180 days on file, right? But if you don't, or you didn't, or you wanted to wait, that's great, because Experian Go actually establishes your credit. So you're already good to go. You're already FICO scoreable by the point in time at which you would actually maybe apply for credit. And if you're lucky, if you're doing the right thing, you're also boosting your credit, which is essentially through the exact same platform and app, just adding in, or appending, if you will, other information that's already in your bank account, right? Think things like utilities if you have them, We even consider like a Netflix or Disney Channel account, the type of account that can actually be used in that, or even like rental information. If you had a rental, that information can actually be sucked in as well. So that's a really cool thing. So if you're doing that, you're already making sure that you are FICO scoreable, which is key. And even if you don't want to be FICO scoreable, right, with before that 180 days, Credit Match can still find you some offers that are going to get you what you need if you're less than 180 days, right? So now we've established what I would do right in those situations. Now let's get to the recommendations, okay? So in a perfect world, right, all things being equal, I would try to get a credit card that is unsecured. And unsecured just simply means that you don't have to necessarily link your own money, your own checking or savings account to that credit card, right? So what will happen with a secured credit card is they will say, okay, we're going to give you a $500 credit line,
Right.
but we're going to need you to put in at least X amount of dollars, 300 all the way up to 500. Sounds like you know what that is, right?
Yeah, that's how I started
Right.
out. I went that route. I didn't know any of that. I didn't know, like, my dad had good credit. I could have gone the authorized user route. Could have, experienced to use some of those tools. Didn't know about it. Just went the secured route and just had a lot of struggles with that.
Yeah.
Being 18, not having a job, being out $300, like, it was tough. So, I would agree with you on the unsecured thing because, yeah, 300, even for us getting a paycheck every month, it's not a lot of money. So being out that money is quite significant. I'm sure a lot of young people are in that same boat. $300, a lot of time you're having to front the bill for that. So it's not ideal.
I think it's very unfair too, because I tell you what, right? If we know, which we do, that the typical secured credit card amount has an available limit of $500, what out there is there that wouldn't actually upset that utilization threshold that we were talking about before,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, $300 out on 500, you're 60% utilized.
Right.
That's bad, bad, bad in the eyes of a credit, algorithm, particularly if it's the only credit that you have, right?
Right.
And so if you were asking me if we're having a larger conversation, what credit should I get? Credit cards would not be the first, right? We compartmentalize this in the idea of like, okay, we're talking only about credit cards. You're nailing all of those things, Jaden, right? At the end of the day, a secured credit card requires too much upfront from you.
Yep.
You're not getting any of the benefits of what a credit card is supposed to give you. And frankly, you're probably putting yourself into utilization jail, if you will, right?
Yeah, no,
We're
I
not
struggled with that too,
like
where it was like trying to buy my plane ticket to come here at West Point as a plebe. My plane ticket was 300 and some odd dollars, and my credit limit was $300. So I couldn't even buy my plane ticket using my credit card. So I was just in a situation where I put it on my debit card because that was the only solution I had to pay for the ticket. So it was I definitely I felt that struggle before.
And that's as much of an indictment against Stewart International Airport as it is, the credit card itself.
Right.
But yes, I completely agree. And, the other thing, when you think about that, and this is why I'm always a little bit hesitant to talk credit cards, is you can't even necessarily use a credit card the way that I can.
Mm.
So if they need a rental car, so if you were to go to a rental agency to
Right.
get home and you were using a credit card, which they usually require, they don't say that. And like just having, your debit card that has the Visa or MasterCard symbol, that's not good enough. They want an actual credit card. A, sometimes they don't accept a secured card. And B, more importantly, in your situation, Jaden, you have to be at least 25 for that to even matter. So for a lot of those key uses of a credit card, you're not even authorized or able to even use it. And so that's why I would just say spend that time getting yourself an established credit history that speaks to kind of that credit history need that we were talking about before in terms of that being a major component of your credit score.
Right. Cool.
But now that
Yeah.
we've really identified that in terms of secured, I would say Credit One would be a great secured credit card to go through. They're very well known. Excuse me. The other key here is that secured credit cards sometimes do not report to the bureau, or if they do it in a very delayed fashion. That can be a problem. If you are doing the right thing and you are paying off your credit card every month, you want them to report that to the bureau every month. Some secured credit cards say, hey, we're going to try to protect you, knowing that a lot of consumers out there aren't necessarily prime acting the way that you are. They know that there are going to be some hiccups along the way. So instead of saying like, okay, Shawn, you didn't pay this month, and so we were going to have to report that to the bureau, we're not going to report anything until you've had 6 months of in a row good, credit reports. And so that's not going to help your score either, right?
Yeah.
Until they actually start to report that. Secured cards do that an awful lot. Unsecured credit cards can still do that, but not necessarily as much. And more importantly than that, that's really the idea behind revolving debt. If you can get one from, say, any of your credit unions or any of the ones that you have special access to, particularly by being a member of the military, that's going to serve you very well.
Yeah, no, in my presentation, I really hit on that because there's USAA, I think, has amazing options, especially for non-commissioned officers. They even have a pre-commissioned officer card specifically built for, you know, Academy cadets and RTC cadets. And then Navy Federal has similar options, and as well as Penn Fed, which I think it's a bad rep around here just because I think the way that they try and get people to sign up for their card during our initial basic training it's a little bit predatory in my opinion, because you're just not in the right headspace to make that call. But needless to say, I do think those three options are great. And I also, I want to get your opinion on this too. Student credit cards. I think a lot of students being in that position where, you're young, you're trying to build credit, and they're better than the secured card route, maybe not quite on par with some of the better unsecured options out there, but they're a good gateway to get in the door. And I kind of want to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to me, the formula is very simple, right? Number one, if you plan to do the right thing, which I think we're presuming we all are here on this call, then you want a card that reports to the bureaus. And you can easily ask that for anybody that you would apply to, right? Do you report to each of the three bureaus? And if you do you do it every single month? And if no, right, what is your actual standards, right? Because it can sometimes be a good thing, right? Just the bottom falls out. You just simply, for whatever reason, simply cannot pay. Then maybe it isn't the worst thing that they didn't necessarily report that month, right? But most of the time, I would say you want to know that. As long as they're doing that, right? As long as they're reporting to the actual bureaus and it is unsecured, then you're golden, right? And if it's secured, that's fine too. But just know exactly what the rules are and you'll be in pretty good shape.
Awesome. Cool.
So
Yeah, I think that's something definitely to look out for. And that's kind of what I hit on in my presentation, like making sure that data is actually getting relayed. Because there's a lot of weird things you'll read online, like, oh yeah, this will help your credit or this will report. But you obviously being behind the scenes, you see that a lot of that data actually isn't shared. So it's really not helping to build your credit the way people might think it is.
It helps to build your marketing profile for other companies to know exactly how you behave, what you might be interested in, try to sell you something. But in terms of helping you, I would 100% agree. If it's not hitting your credit report and it's not positive information, then I would argue it's not helping.
Right. I actually got offered. So, by doing content, I got offered by a brand who has like a debit as a credit card thing. And part of it was I couldn't get a clear idea of how their reporting process works. Like, how are they actually helping, I guess target demographic would be someone like me, young people. How is that helping them build credit? I couldn't get a clear idea. I actually turned the deal down because it was, I couldn't see myself recommending it to someone because I couldn't get that clear picture of, hey, this is actually helping, get from no credit to established credit, because there wasn't that clear transparency like other cards out there that would say, hey, we're reporting to TransUnion, Experian, Equifax, whereas this card, it just said it'll help build your score. Okay, I said, okay, what, how exactly? And I'm talking to, people behind the scenes, employees at the company. I couldn't get a clear answer. So I turned that deal down because I'm not going to recommend something that I myself wouldn't use. Because I
love that you're acting.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I see it is, sure, I could make money. That'd be good for myself. But long-term, my reputation would take a hit. And that's not something I would be willing to do, giving bad advice like that. So
let me do one better actually.
Yeah, what's up?
We're dealing with that an awful lot here where I work at the bureau.
Yep.
So the CFPB, right, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is really starting to crack down on a lot of these lenders. There's one lender in particular, a type of lender that's, well, actually we'll talk about two. There are payday lenders, which I don't think this group was. And then you have what we would consider buy now, pay laters, or BNPLs. Now, there are some above board, very good companies that are doing this, right? Those pay forward, and they're doing things in a way to establish or build your credit. But then you have other ones that I would say are certainly lower when they don't act with the same integrity and they're not helping your credit whatsoever. They're essentially just coming up with ways to get money for you that they
Right.
can then use to lend out to others, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily want to be a part of that. If they can't tell you specifically what their business model is and how it specifically works with the three bureaus, then I think you made exactly the right decision.
Yeah, I know. I kind of mulled it over for a few days, and the deadline was coming up to produce the content, and yeah, I couldn't, in my right consciousness, like go ahead with that just because of, again, I couldn't see that clear translation of, hey, this is actually like you said, our business model of how we actually do what we claim to do. Because it's easy to claim that you do something, but actually, doing that's a lot harder. We're kind of getting close on time. The last little segment I want to talk about is just business credit. We don't gotta go super in depth. I just kind of want to talk about some of the big overarching differences between personal and business credit, and then kind of like the first one or two steps to building business credit. Because I get a lot of questions about that. I've started building my business credit profile, LLC formation, EIN number registration, and just walking into Chase and kind of walking through that whole process with people. I still get questions, so I just kind of want to get your input from an expert perspective, and what you would say when you're going down that route, if you choose to go down that route when it comes to business credit.
Absolutely. The first thing that I would remember is that 95% of all businesses started with consumer credit, right? And
Okay.
so there's almost an inextricable link between business credit and right, or sole proprietorships, right? So those still often have a consumer credit aspect. You start to get into like C corps in particular, they don't, right?
Yeah.
S corps even can have like have a consumer bent to it. So here's how I would say it, Jaden. Right, consumer credit is all about your overall ability and willingness to pay, as evidenced by your credit trade lines in the past and your level, if you will, of utilization moving forward, right? That's really all it is. Business credit, though, is essentially an estimate, approximation, prediction, whatever you want to call it, of your financial health as a financial and business entity. And so, what is it that they're looking at? What populates a business credit report? Well, it's all things having to do with financial health, right? Wants to have to do with your assets, your market capitalization, any ups and downs in terms of delinquencies that you've had in terms of making your vendor payments, making sure that you don't fall on certain vendor lists in terms of non-payment, that kind of thing. And then just making sure, certainly from like a personal, excuse me, a public records perspective, that you don't have other types of collections or bankruptcies in particular, like a Chapter 11, right? Something like that. And so that's going to be your major difference. So whereas a business is being looked at, and we're credit wise, we're looking at your actual numbers, your cash flow, your market cap, right? Your worth, that kind of thing. That's not a part of consumer credit. We don't allow that to be a part of your credit. So when you have consumers say that, oh, I got dinged or I was declined by this credit score because I didn't make enough, that's not true. No credit algorithm or score in any way looks at income. It is not what we call adverse actionable. Adverse action means simply that we can decline you if we see something that we don't like. We can't decline you based off of that income in a score because it's not in there. Can a bank decline you because you don't have the ability to pay or your income's low? Yes, but it's not because of the credit score itself. Credit score is only looking at your past trade line history, right? Your future history in terms of its estimates based on how you've handled that
Right.
and any additional public records that you have on file. So that's what I would say would be the big difference.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. And then second part to that is just the first steps. Just kind of like I said, LLC or some sort of business entity formation. And then after that, getting an EIN. Um,
Yep.
I mean, I've walked through the entire process, and I guess, like, I don't know if it's just, and feel free to kind of put your input on this, but I don't know if it's just a pushback to sort of like having that entrepreneurial spirit, just like, I don't know what it is, but people get very almost defensive or very like, because for me, I wanted to form a business entity to actually fund my photography business. So running, my expenses on my camera gear, my computer through my business lines, and then having my expenses actually tracked under a employer identification number. So that was why I did it, because I wanted to be taken more seriously as a photographer and taken more seriously in that aspect. But I guess a lot of people are just either confused or just, I don't know. I don't know what the hang up is. I was curious, like, what you might think that is or where you might think that comes from. That might be kind of a hard question, but I don't know. It's
Yeah,
kind of
I think
your
no, it's a very fair question, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? We're never taught any of this in school,
sure.
and I think it's very esoteric reason, right? I think historically we've used this as a way to separate different people for whatever reason. So here's what I would say in this situation. A business is just wanting to make sure that if they loan you money, they will get it back. So whatever you can do to hammer home the idea that you are a good credit risk, you're going to be fine. And that's why I refuse to have this conversation if we're not also talking about consumer credit, because
Right.
you don't build business credit without consumer credit. I was actually counseling somebody who is actually starting their own, I think they want to be an influencer, right? And they've been very successful doing that. And, the funny thing is that things started happening just like you said, Jaden. The minute that he, in this particular situation, created his own LLC, right?
Yep.
And then in that situation, that allowed him to get an EIN. And it wasn't until he had that EIN on file and wasn't able to show that, show the business license in the state of California to the bank that they would even allow him to open a business checking account.
Right.
So this person in the situation had a little bit of his own money in a checking account. They wouldn't even allow him to create a business checking account till he'd gotten the EIN and he'd gotten, of course, the LLC status, right? So that's the first thing. So you've done 80% of what you needed to do there. In that situation, now let's go back to the credit card, right? You have your business account, you have your business checking or savings account that you can use for drafts and cash flow,
Yep.
right? Now you can just start to change out your credit card that you're using for your own personal purposes into a corporate card, or you can use that and just use the expenditures and act as if that card is being used for the business. And then when it comes to tax time, just make sure that you're itemizing it. If you do that, sometimes the banks will actually just give you a line of credit in that situation, which can either be revolving debt or it can be like some type of loan. If you've had any type of history of making money, again, I just want to make sure that you have money, right? It needs money. I have to have money to make money, right? As long as you can tell me that, I will probably support you. That is, I think, the missing component of a lot of business quests that are out there that just go unfulfilled.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think one of the first things that you said on our last interview is bankability, just showing that you have income that's verifiable. People are like, "Oh, I wasn't able to do X, Y, Z, get a business credit card." It's like, well, do you have a balance sheet? Are you actually like generating any sort of revenue through the business? And for most businesses, that's just not the case. I think a lot of people, and this is, I get questions about it, right? Oh, I should do this and that. It's like, well, maybe find a business model that's actually generating some money first before you make that
Yes.
call, because you're kind of having the chicken before the egg, if you will, in a sense, because you're not generating any money, but now you're extending lines of credit that you're liable to pay without having a way to pay it. Sure, you can come out of your personal income to do so, but you're trying to do it as a business that has not yet generated money. So that's kind of, I guess, the hang up a lot of people have, and they just, yeah.
Well, they frankly, they watch too much TV or they see too many things on the internet, right? And everything doesn't start out the way that, it did for Mark Zuckerberg and some of those other groups that are out there, those startups, right? That is by far the exception. The rule is exactly what you talked about, which is exactly why you want to start a business checking account so that you can show your cash flow, so that you can verify, to your point, that you are bankable, right? It's never going to be a situation where somebody's going to give you a loan of $35 million just based on your idea. It happens 1 in a million times, right?
Well,
And
you see on Shark
you have
Tank
to-
too, like they have a great idea, and then the next thing they ask is like, how much are you making? How much is, yearly
Yep.
revenue? And that makes or break their decision to invest, right? They're not going to lend money like a bank would, right? If they're not this business owner with their great idea can't show that it is profitable in any sort of sense, or not even necessarily profitable, but just having money coming in to show that it is, I guess a cash generator or cash revenue stream.
It's interesting, Jaden, because I've actually worked with somebody who was on that show right in front of Mark Cuban and the others, right?
Mhm.
And the idea one, even in that situation, then this is what they don't show you, right? Is that person still had to do a number of different things, had to jump through a couple of other hoops to show that this business was viable before they got any cash. And by the way, she was never able to do that. So the $1 million that they said that they were going to fund her never happened because she was never able to make just a very specific thing in that idea work. And this was actually more on the IT level, right? So never think for a second that it's not anything other than your ability to sell. The definition of a business is the ability to sell a service or a product at a premium, if you will, so that you could actually make money on top of what you're actually selling. It's a value proposition. And that's what it will always be. And so as long as you're mindful of doing the things that you're talking about, Jaden, you will always be a business that will always be supported as long as you don't go delinquent.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I think we tackled everything I wanted to cover today. I appreciate you being willing to work with me on this. Kind of continuing our credit conversation series part 2. And yeah, just kind of dropping some of your knowledge and wisdom for my audience, and then as well as just people who might come along and just see your content. I'm definitely going to share that with some of my relatives who asked me in the credit repair space, and then some of my friends kind of starting off building credit, right? What are some of the things that they need to watch out for, and some of the things that they need to keep in mind. And then lastly, that business thing too, where it's not as easy as you might believe, but also there's a very set number of steps that you need to jump through and make sure you're jumping through, because a lot of people they want to go from 0 to 100 without doing the steps in between.
Absolutely nailed it. Absolutely. I love what you're doing, and what you're doing is so important. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just a lot of it was stemming from, like I told you about, where I started with that secured card and just all the struggles I had with that. And I was like, it's got to be a better way to navigate this. And I didn't know until I started building up my knowledge. I read, I think I read "I Will Make You Rich" by Ramat Sethi. I don't want to botch that name, but it's a great book, and a lot of it talks about credit and just that financial health and attaining that financial literacy. I read that book, and it was a great stepping stone. And then I started going on online blogs and forums and watching content. And I was like, I think I've got to a point where I can start also trying to be someone in that space that could share content at a relatable level. You're hearing it from someone who maybe has already attained what you're already trying to achieve. There's a disconnect. So I wanted to be that person who's kind of walking alongside my audience. Hey, I'm here. Here's exactly what I'm doing, and just documenting the process, because I think people like to see that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation that you're going to have. I believe, what is it, next week?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
And this one's geared more towards actual lenders themselves. But I think it'd be cool for you to listen in, because now you'll get to hear it from the perspective of those lenders themselves, right?
What are they looking for?
They're worried right now too. Exactly. And like, what are the new types of data? Because we're going to get into some of this as well, which we didn't get into on this call, right? What are the things that they're looking to help them in this time where there's a little bit of uncertainty? We're going to get into things like consumer permission data, cash flow analysis, which we've talked about a little bit here, right? Some other stuff. And if you understand what they're looking for, you can understand how to be better on your side.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's we talk about enemy analysis a lot. And not saying they're the enemy, but you got to understand what you're getting yourself into, for sure.
Right.
So yeah, I push that out to the finance team. We'll write up a memo for it next week. So hopefully the turnout will be pretty good. It's a little bit hard with the scheduling, just in the middle of the day, for us. But was that time Eastern Standard Time, or was that West Coast Standard Time?
Yeah, so it's going to be 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Yeah.
1 p.m. Eastern. Yeah. So might have to, the attendance might be a little bit iffy just due to the timing of it. I'll certainly do my best within the constraints of what I got to do to be there, because I definitely think it'd be great, information for everybody.